Episode 1. This episode is part of the Faith in the Nexus Exploring Children's Spirituality series. It explores what we mean by spirituality and reflects on the understanding of children as spiritual beings, which is something that underpins our research.
Welcome to our podcast, Exploring Children's Spirituality. I'm Dr. Anne Casson, Senior Research Fellow at National Institute for Christian Education Research at Canterbury Christ Church University. We've just completed a large research project called Faith in the Nexus. But before I explain some detail about that, let me introduce our guest today, Kieran O'Brien and Nick Taunt. Kieran.
I am Kieran O'Brien. I'm the director of Media Story. We're a storytelling agency which have been working alongside NICE and Anne in developing storytelling resources. And my background is around storytelling and also around spirituality.
And Nick.
Hi, I'm Nick Taunt. I am a retired head teacher, having been an English teacher all my life in comprehensive secondary schools, 11 to 18 schools, and the last 18 years as head of Bishop Buffer School, a church secondary comprehensive in Chichester. I'm now an educational consultant, which is a grand title for meaning I'm part-time and doing stuff which I'm interested in, like how children grow in faith, and particularly how they develop from early childhood into young adulthood and beyond.
Thank you both very much. I'm really looking forward to our discussion this morning. To give a little bit of background to the Faith in the Nexus project, we started this 3 years ago, and we looked at 20 church primary schools, looking to see how they supported or facilitated children's exploration of faith, in particular how they did this in the home environment. So 20 schools are based right across the country, different areas, suburban, urban, different areas of multiple deprivation. And I went into these schools and interviewed pupils, staff, various individuals who come into school in various different ways, local clergy, and looked at what was going on within these schools, focusing on the child. What was the child's perception? What was happening for the child? Our key findings that came out of this were really quite interesting. We found children initiating conversations, initiating faith talk in the home and in school. And we also found children who were seeking. They were seeking spaces to reflect. They were seeking spaces of quietness and looking for time when they could just think things through or reflect on what had happened. I'll give some examples as we go through the podcast of some of the interesting experiences these children shared with us. The other finding was a deep sense of belonging, a sense of belonging to a church school, to a Christian community, and for many of the children and the parents, a sense of belonging to church. Whatever that meant to them, there was a sense that they belonged to something community that was bigger than their small community of the village or home. I think to start this podcast, we need to sort of go right back to the beginning. We're talking about exploring children's spirituality. What do we mean by spirituality? It's a really difficult concept to grapple with. Do you want to jump in, Nick, with some ideas that you...
Yeah, I think the problem with spirituality is that so many people have decided what they mean by it. And probably that's what we have to do. We mean by spirituality this, while other people mean that, and so on. And it's interesting, isn't it, that companies increasingly have developed spirituality policies, for example, and there they mean respect and compassion, and perhaps a little sprinkling of mindfulness alongside that as well. I think our spirituality definition stems from a sense that actually we are all spiritual. It's not something that you catch, but actually from throughout our lives, from very, very early on, we are trying to make sense of our surroundings and of our experience. As very young children, the most important people in our experience will be those closest to us, a mother or father or parents or the wider family. And they're the ones who who help to guide us through what our experience is and how to understand it. And as we grow up, we start trying for ourselves to make sense of our experience. We want a sense of purpose, don't we? And alongside that, I think goes an understanding of who we are as individuals. I mean, exactly who am I is part. So you've got a bit of identity, which is inside, that part of us which is innate. Who am I? And that need for purpose. And then there's the outside world, which is constantly pressing in with new experiences. And we're trying to fit that into our picture of life, which is ever widening. It's a jigsaw puzzle which just gets larger and larger all the time. And into my 60s, it's still getting larger. I can't see the ends yet. So I've not even got anywhere near the sky in this particular jigsaw puzzle. But we're fitting these bits together.
I think that's really interesting idea, and it's really important the way the assumption we have that everybody is a spiritual being. One of the things I think we need to explore a little bit is how does this fit within Christianity? Because I know in some contexts people put spiritual up against Christianity, and what we're talking about is spirituality within a Christian framework. That maybe Kieran, there's some idea of how we fit this idea of spirituality within a Christian framework without losing the much deeper and wider sense we want to keep of everybody as a spiritual being.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question around spirituality versus religion. And I think the more I look into it, I see it's almost a part in a way, spirituality on the one hand, and religion on the other, as if they are doing different jobs in different ways. And I can remember seeing some research a while ago. It's fascinating about the decline of in America of people who count themselves religious, but they kind of went down. And the number of people who counted themselves or considered themselves as spiritual, and that number all went up. But what I was more fascinated by was the amount of people who saw themselves as religious and not spiritual. And I was thinking, what does that mean? Because how can you be religious and not spiritual? And it's almost these terms we're kind of reacting to. We think spirituality looks like this, mindfulness, or so whatever that looks like, a secular kind of spirituality. And then in Christianity, it's all about spirituality. So I can't see how you can split the two. But then when I first started this project, I think I knew what spirituality was. I had a very clear idea. And then into the third or fourth week of writing the scripts for these resources, I was like, actually, I have no idea, do I? It's one of those things. So once you try to tie it down, spirituality, let's put it into this box. The more you ask questions around it, the more I was feeling, actually, I'm not really sure how to tie this one down because it's a very loose concept. What is spirituality? And I think Nick's right, is our inner search for meaning, for purpose, our deep desire for connection, for love. And that's universal. We all have a spirituality. And when I look at the NHS, they have a whole guidance around spirituality, and they say it beautifully. So we all have a spirituality, whether we believe in God or not. It's an expression of who we are, fundamental sense of belonging, our worldviews. It encapsulates all of that. It's not just what we think, it goes deep to the heart of who we are. And that's what we're trying to get to at spirituality, is answer the deep questions of who am I, where do I belong, what am I here for, how does this all make sense? And these are the big questions, and children especially are grappling with.
Yeah.
Wonder if spirituality is a way of distinguishing spirituality from Christianity or religion, if you like, is simply to say that spirituality is about the process. It's about how we think. It's about the actual process of reflection, and religion, and we're talking specifically about Christianity, is actually the, if you like, the content. Of course, it's not just a content that you accept and you stick in your rucksack and then just walk around with it. It's something which is itself active. And we talk about, as Christians, we talk about being on a journey, but we're using the practice of spirituality, the actual working out the process of it, to develop our own sense of that Christian journey. And that's perhaps why some people say that they're Christian, but they're not spiritual. And that's, I go to church, I accept everything that's said in church, and then I come out and I carry on as before.
I think you said something really interesting there, Nick, about it being the active. It's spirituality is the active. It's that energizer within faith that provides that faith isn't, if Christian faith is not passive. It sort of leads the idea of the Holy Spirit. It brings all that in, the Desert Fathers, and that idea of it's something that is actually active and energizing faith. But it is within Christianity, but not exclusively within Christianity. But it is very valid. It's going back to what Kieran says. You can't imagine being Christian without being spiritual, but have some sense of the spirituality, of the spiritual nature of the world, of the self. Yeah, that is integral to our understanding of what it is to be Christian.
Yes, I mean, George Herbert, the 17th century poet, talks in, there's a poem of his, The Pulley, where he talks about God giving us all the gifts, but he keeps behind the gift of rest, so that we remain restless. Because if we had rest, then we might worship what is created rather than the creator, suggests Herbert. And that restlessness, I think, is common to all who are religious, because we see a way of satisfying that restlessness through faith. And in Christianity, we St. Augustine talks about our being. He says, "You've made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it finds its rest in you," says Augustine.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think that brings out the other idea of what we're meaning by spirituality is it's about relationships as well. We're not talking about that ascetic with that hermit, it's Simon of Stylites up on top of his pillar, that sort of idea of spirituality. What comes through in the Nexus project and what is our assumptions about spirituality is it's about relations with other people and relationships with God. And it's that relational aspect of it which is critical to children's understanding of what it is to be spiritual.
Yes. So if spiritual is the process, and our Christianity is the, if you like, is the product. Actually, the product is relationships. Yeah. And we never talk about our relationships being static, like a product, something that is made. It is always in flux. Relationships are always in flux, aren't they? And we're always finding out more about ourselves and about others and about God as well.
Yeah.
Kieran. And I was thinking, when you're saying that, Nick, it's back to that question, how do you define spirituality and religion? And it's what is it like a Venn diagram? There's an overlap. It's all they integrated to each other. And I think as a Catholic grown up, I was given the catechism, and that was my spirituality. Who am I? Well, it's on page 2, paragraph 3. Where do I belong? All the big questions there was an answer for. And what I really like about the Nexus project is, although the research doesn't really go into that specific issue, it does look at the issue of what happens when we look at the spiritual needs of a child, and rather than giving them set answers, which they are there in abundance, so you can find your catechisms and everything, we know that those set answers aren't resonating as much as they did with audiences of previous generations. That somehow there's something missing. And spirituality, if you give it kind of a secular kind of modern day spin, is that inner search for meaning. I need to find the answers for myself, and that searching, that desire, that longing, that looking, can take you off in any direction, as we can see. And I think from a Christian spirituality perspective, I think is how do you hold the tensions between religion, which is it can have this almost catechetical, here's the answers here, this is what it is, join us, join this group, and it's all done for you, to this desire to find out for yourself, but not go off in kind of several directions. You still remain within the Christian kind of storyline, and that's a difficult tension to hold. And it's also the future of Christianity. How do we get young people to still do the spiritual journey, but do it alongside within the Christian story? And that's not as easy as it sounds on the first instance.
I think that's picked up something really critical, the idea that how do we avoid giving out all the answers, because we haven't got all the answers, in sort of like that strict road, this is the way to go. Oh, the other way, well, here's lots of roads, just choose the one you would like yourself. And yourself, if you're faced with a choice of hundreds of thousands, it becomes impossible to make a choice. You try many different things. It's where do we get that balance in the middle? And I think that was some of what the Nexus project was grappling with. And certainly the parents I spoke to in the project were grappling with, like, well, we haven't got the right answers. We want the right answers. Can we give them the right answers? Or let's just let them make their own mind up. It's really important they make their own mind up. But I think what we came through with was this middle pathway, which comes clearly through the animation, this sort of, well, how do we find this middle pathway between saying there are only these answers, and if you don't accept these, you're not part of it, or it's up to everybody themselves. They're totally individualistic, relativistic. You just make your own mind up and do what you want.
Yes, it's very seductive, isn't it, to have all the answers?
Yes,
and you do see, I think, as children grow up, particularly in their later young adult years, there's a bit of a thirst for certainty. And there are some children, and I saw this at school, some children who want to be absolutely certain about everything. And that ends up being quite exclusive, because if you've got all the answers as you see it in this neat package, what happens when experience suddenly challenges those things? And it happens, you see, when people form gangs or groups of similar like-minded people. There's all the sense of loyalty, of belonging that you've mentioned earlier, and the sense of this is what we believe in. But when challenged, it doesn't fit, and you eventually start feeling, actually, I'm constrained by this group because I'm being prevented from doing things that I think are right by the group ethos. And that sense of experience always crowding in and challenging what we have been taught, particularly the things that we were taught as young children, which necessarily were quite simple we've our dealing with children growing up and meeting those challenges has not caught up with the complexity of modern life. And I think it's at that point that that's when the church and perhaps parents and perhaps school sort of steps back a bit, because we fall back upon old certainties, but we can see that they're not actually fitting what this child needs.
And I think that that's very true of many of these children, that if you're given an answer and then life comes in and you see, well, that answer doesn't fit anymore, it then becomes quite difficult if you haven't thought it through or been taught to explore these areas. That, well, what do? I just reject it, because if that answer's wrong, the whole thing must be wrong. And I think for parents as well, when you're dealing with children asking really challenging questions, like, why does God allow people to die? Why is this happening to us now? Then if you haven't got a certain answer, it's very vulnerable. It's a very vulnerable place to be in when you haven't got those certain answers. And where do you go from there? Where do you,
And as an adult, yourself might feel just the same, that what happens when you die? Well, you go to heaven. And as an adult, you're thinking, well, what is that? And where is heaven? And what do we mean by it? And we all as parents feel uncomfortable when we're saying something that is true on a very simple level, but on a more complicated level, the sort of level that as children grow up into adolescence and beyond feels rather too simplistic. It doesn't satisfy. And I think that you're right. I think parents start to withdraw when they're telling the child of the simple answer feels no longer satisfying, either for the child or the parent. And it's how do we as parents actually bridge that gap, or grow in our discussing with our children these issues that our children are, these deep issues that our children are asking questions about.
And I was just going to reflect on when we were making the animation, the story, there was one section which we had a lot of discussion around, and it's this very issue around the world has become much more complex for children, young people. What does that mean? And we're not just talking about complexity, mobile phones, social media, communication. That's obviously is a layer of complexity. Is that, and from a storytelling perspective, I'll put it this way, that we no longer live in a single story universe. Now, when I grew up, I come from a Irish Catholic heritage. So both my parents grew up in Catholic Ireland, and they lived under a single story, and that was Catholic, Christian. Everyone was Christian, pretty much. Pretty much everyone was Catholic in the South, whether you went to church or not. It was just the norm. Other world religions existed, but outside the bubble, there was very little interaction with them. And that's the kind of faith that was passed on to me, that it was very much, this is it. This is the whole universe. It's explained in this single story. I think trying to grow up in a single story universe in today's world is almost impossible, because we have so many competing narratives, so many worldviews, and enriching worldviews. So it's not problematic, it's good. Hearing different cultures, different perspectives, different spiritualities, and they can all help enriching. But it comes back to that sense of belonging. Where do I belong now? If I don't belong in this single story, do I have no story at all? Do I just find out my own way? And that's, I feel, is kind of the underlying push towards kind of individualistic kind of spirituality, because I don't know what my story is. I will just kind of dabble in this and that, bit of mindfulness, maybe a bit of Christianity here, and just find my own way. And so it becomes very problematic. The stresses and strain children, young people find today are unlike the stresses and strain we had from previous generations. It's totally new and unique. So we can't just look to old ways to fix new problems. Oh, that worked for me, why doesn't it work for my children? I grew up with this kind of belief, why don't my children understand it? Is that they are grown up in a different worldview, different experience, different kind of interaction of ideas and concepts. And even in education, critical thinking is encouraged rather than seen as a threat. What might happen from previous kind of educational models. So all these things are kind of merging together. So when it comes back to this question, how do we help children grow in a spirituality in a Christian context? Actually, that's really hard, because what might have worked before may no longer work. So therefore, we have to move away from this approach to Christian children's spirituality. Here's the answer. We just need to find out what the answer is, maybe dress up slightly and give it to them, to a child-centered perspective. How do we start with the child's spiritual needs, where they're at the center, and take them on a journey, a spiritual journey through the Christian tradition? And that's it's a different way of thinking. I don't know what you think, Anne.
I think that's really true. And I think picking up on what you were saying, one of the things that strikes me, and it struck me through the Faith and Nexus report, is that children are seeking, that they're not disinterested. And if we don't provide them answers, they're going to go seeking elsewhere. That it's not saying that actually, this isn't going to happen if you don't talk about faith and whatever. Well, that's just going to stop. There's disinterest. But I didn't find the disinterest. I found that questioning, that curiosity, that searching. What is it? What is the purpose? Why are we here? What is it all about? That just carries on and continues. That I think the positive of this, complex, diverse world view, the multiple worldviews, is that children are seeking. Young people are continually seeking, and it's how we resource them so that they can seek in a more fruitful way, more fulfilling way, I think is really important. Nick,
it's a very rich process, isn't it?
Yes.
What we're talking about, and it's in schools we have recognized that, and we as teachers in the classroom, both primary and secondary, and actually beyond, of course, we're encouraging children to think about how they learn. So in a maths class, we have children who write their diaries every now and then about how they're getting on in maths and what they find particularly difficult, and that's part of the asking questions, isn't it? How do I solve this problem? I really don't understand this way of doing it. Are there other ways of looking at it? And being able to work with children in that way as a teacher means that the child is much more involved and sees the value of it, because I, as the teacher, and the child, we are both sharing the same issue. How do we help you to understand in a way that makes sense to you? Now, in maths, there are not lots of different answers to +2. In fact, there's only one answer to that particular one on a simple level. And I'm sure some maths professor will say, well, actually, no, there are other answers to that question if you look at it in a slightly different way. But you've got to come to realize why it's true, why the 2 + 2 = 4 actually works. Yeah. But you've got to find it for yourself rather than just accept it.
Yeah. And I think that's a really interesting idea, which came through the Faith and the Nexus, is that exploring together, that the teacher and the pupil working together. And I think we've spoken before about co-creation, the co-creating. It's the child and the adult together, that it's not sort of just an adult passing on knowledge to the child. The child is a very active agent. Yet certainly the children, if you go into primary schools and speak to young children, they are active agents. They are working things through for themselves. They are co-creating, and they're co-creating their learning. But also, if you go into the area of spirituality and of faith, they are co-creators in school and in the home. They are often the ones who bring ideas home, which talk through with the parents. And it's that dialogue, that active dialogue, creative dialogue, which is really valuable there.
Yes, and perhaps a bit frightening for parents who've not seen it
Yes.
before. That actually children asking these questions is the beginning of learning. It's what children need, and it's actually how they learn. They are constantly making sense of things. I mean, if you look at language, you know, a child learning to talk will talk about sheeps. And the reason why they talk about sheeps is because they've heard the word tweet and tweets. So if there's more than one, you just stick an S on the end, you know. Or they talk about mouses because this girl has heard someone talk about a house and houses, and they just add that sound on to the end of mouse, and they are making sense of stuff even when it's wrong to start off with. And there will be little bits that we will need to correct them. But that basic principle of making sense and working out for themselves and finding things out, and with guidance being shown the right way forward, is how children learn.
And I think it's in moments. A lot of the parents I spoke to, and a lot of the children, these questions come at odd moments. It might be in the middle of breakfast or when you're just out for a walk. And it's just that moment they've got the question, and then it's a decision as to how the parent responds at that moment in time. Yeah, which is challenging when you're very busy trying to get everybody's breakfast on the table and that, but the child just comes out with that moment. And if you don't attend to it, then it's gone. They've moved on to something else. And it's just thinking about, you know, how do we respond to those questions, which are quite profound for children.
Yeah, and it's without going into another subject altogether, but it's a fascinating one around how do we answer questions? Because you know, Nick, you're right. It's if you go to a maths lesson, so 2 + 2 = 4. And someone says, well, actually, what do we mean by 2? You know, we're not going to get very far in the maths lesson. But when we're doing kind of faith spirituality, if we go in with 2 + 2 = 4, well, I've got the answer. Well, you haven't done anything. You haven't done any spiritual kind of, you know, inner search or questioning. You have to ask, what does 2 mean? So it's a very different mindset we're trying to, skill set we're trying to bring into kind of spirituality. And my feeling is we try to, from my perspective, whether it's true or not, we try to do religion and spirituality with a 2 + 2 = 4 mindset. This is what it is. If X equals this, Y must be this. It's almost like a formulaic exercise. And that's why you can have answers in a book. But when it comes to spirituality, the answers in the book can help you think deeper. But sometimes it's poetry, it's art, it's things that take you deeper into the mystery. And I'm writing a series in a moment called Grown in Love, and in that we speak about the onion. You know, so it's, the onion, it's the mystery of the onion is that it's mystery is not something that you can't understand. It's something that you infinitely understand. The more you go into it, you peel away each layer, you find a deeper layer there. So some of the questions we ask in spirituality are not 2 + 2 = 4 questions. Who am I? You know, how do you answer that? And I love it's that story of St. Francis, whether it's true or not, when he went into a cave and he just prayed the same prayer again. Who am I and who are you? Who am I and who? I just kept saying that prayer again and again, going deeper and deeper with it. And that to me is that spiritual question. How do we answer spiritual questions? You go deeper into the answer rather than coming out with 2 + 2 = 4.
I suppose that suggests a way forward for parents who are tempted to give a straight answer, or to actually to deflect the question and through embarrassment turn to something else. that actually what we're talking about is is what our aspirations for our children actually are. We want them to flourish, and just as we help them to flourish by feeding them food that's nutritious and so on, and helping them to be physically well, and perhaps helping them with their maths homework so that they can be mentally well too, and other things. But we're also wanting them to be spiritually well, and part of that is asking questions and not having simple answers to them. So, encouraging those questions, and possibly encouraging an answer to those questions, which itself is uncertain. I'm not sure of your question. How should we think about it, do you think? How are we going to find out?
I think that's really important. It's that sense of some of the questions children ask are unanswerable, and around, answerable sociology, but it's that mystery, isn't it? It's just being able to say with them, actually, I don't know. Let's think about that one. And thinking about it together, because we want to retain the curiosity of the child. We want to that searching, that exploring, and that going deeper and deeper into questions as to, why are we here? Why do people die? And the depth of understanding that there are no simple answers, but the adults are exploring with them, that there's not that divide. Because often you find people think there are people out there with all the answers. I know I speak to some people who don't go to church with the assumption that those people who go through the church door, the congregation, they've got it sorted. They know all of the answers. And, many people will say, well, you need to ask a teacher or ask the vicar. They know all the answers. And it's that idea of assumption that there are experts, when if you explore a little bit deeper, nobody's an expert. Nobody's got answers to all these questions. But what they can do is just sit and think and explore with the child. And often that's what the child wants. The child wants somebody to listen and to take their question seriously, not dismiss it with an easy, facile answer, but just to take it and think through it with them. And maybe they don't come to an answer. Children have wonderful descriptions of nature. One child spoke to me about the butterfly's wing, how fantastic it was. And they'd really looked at this and studied this. And they didn't want an answer of how it was made or whatever, but just to sit with them a little bit and wonder about the beauty of a butterfly's wing.
It's interesting that just you're talking about the illustration of a butterfly's wing helps us to understand what you're saying. And here's Jesus, who presumably actually did know all the answers. He doesn't talk in that way. He talks by giving images, and by telling stories. And I wonder if, as a parent, when my children were a bit older now, would say, well, what does happen after death? Because our children saw members of the family dying, granny and grandma and grandpa and so on, dying. We've not got a clear answer, but we can say, well, what did Jesus do when a friend of his died? And you think of Lazarus, and you can talk about, well, it's extraordinary, isn't it, that Jesus actually wept? He knew what was going to happen. He knew he was going to bring him back to life, but he wept. So what? And there's a whole discussion there, just from what does that suggest about what God thinks about death, and then the fact that he says, "Only believe," to Mary and Martha, who were both, a bit cross with Jesus for delaying turning up, and so on, and then asking him to. Jesus asking to roll the stone away, and they say, "Oh no, it's going to be nasty." No, actually, Jesus faces the unpleasantness and the muckiness of death, even though he knows that he's going to raise Lazarus. and that kind of discussion, why do you think Jesus did that? Actually helps us to understand not the whole answer, but an approach to death when our children ask.
And I think that's really important, Kieran, that idea of stories, isn't it? It's that storytelling and putting these questions within the bigger narrative, I think.
Yeah, and I could probably lecture for several hours around the importance of storytelling, and but just in summary,
Or give an advert.
Yeah. The importance of storytelling we can't overlook in any way. All reality is interpreted reality, and we interpret reality through our inner narratives, which is a story. So it's when we tell stories, we do something really powerful. And we think about it, it's Western culture, our world has changed, been shifted by one man a few thousand years ago, sitting down and telling stories about lost coins, a lost sheep. And you look back at them, not that great stories. They're not cliffhangers. They're not going to make a film out of them. They're just very simple stories talking about the nature of God, revealing the nature of God. And somehow those stories kind of penetrate us, and they do something deep within us. And that's why we gather every Sunday and we read the stories again and again. We've heard them, but we read them again because we keep going deeper and deeper into these stories. Storytelling and spirituality, you can't split the two, I think. It's to do spirituality is to do storytelling, and vice versa. That when you do good storytelling, it has a spiritual dimension to it because it does something deep within us. It gives us, it helps us to connect the pieces, helps us to deal with the big issues in life, anxiety, and also it's who am I, where do I belong? All those big questions can be done through storytelling. I'm not too sure they can be done through kind of bullet points. It's kind of the catechetical. This is the answer approach. A book, with all the paragraphs, the answer to life, because who's written those and how popular have they been? Not very popular because they don't give the answers in a deep, meaningful way. So when Jesus tells a story, what happens in storytelling is you're invited into that space as a witness. So you're not hearing information. Jesus, I think the saying goes, he was asked 163 questions, of which he only answered 3. So he's not an answer giver. He's a storyteller, and that's important. So when we lose our ability to tell stories, we lose something rich about our Christian traditions. So return to storytelling is important. But when we tell a story, we're invited into that space emotionally, and spiritually, and in that space, we are part of that story. So if you think about the prodigal son, brilliant story. It's around mercy. That despite the son who did everything right, he didn't get it, and the one who did it all wrong, who failed, he returns into the loving embrace of the father, and the fatted calf is killed, and etc. And a celebration. Very simple story, but that story reveals something deep about mercy, about love, about tenderness that you can't get through on a bullet points kind of answer and question kind of narrative. By going into storytelling, we can explore some of the deepest spiritual questions in a much more meaningful way. So that's why I was delighted to be part of this project, to be able to look at a well-researched piece of work, but also how do we bring it into a story? And that was a very interesting process for us, I think, because setting out an academic piece is good, but then how do we bring that into a story and bring all that research into the archetypes that play a role in this story? And how do those archetypes interact with a child in our story? And through that, you can then explore much deeper some of the underlying issues that came out of the research, and hopefully in some ways enriches what the research has already done.
And that's a really interesting illustration of how we can use stories with children. because the story of the prodigal son, many people have known from early childhood. And we take it for granted that we actually see it slightly differently, or perhaps we see it more from the boy's point of view, the prodigal son and the faithful son. And that seems entirely unfair, that the prodigal son gets the fatted calf, gets the celebration, you know, the gig out on the beach, whereas the faithful son doesn't. We look at it in different ways as we grow up, and that's also what's happening with younger children. That from the simple story, perhaps when it's first told, when you first hear it as a very young child, it becomes more complicated or more leveled or more like your onion skin, Kieran, as time goes on. And there's no harm in us as parents exploring that and encouraging that, looking at the stories in a slightly different way, because it might meet some of the uncertainties of a child saying, yes, but it wasn't fair.
Yeah.
That the faithful one didn't get anything. What's going on there? And we can say, well, yes, it does look a bit odd, doesn't it? But it also says something about the quality of God's love, you know, unconditional love, that God runs towards us, even when we've turned our back wholly on him.
I think that's really interesting. I think we've moved the discussion about these questions from the idea that these questions are got mathematical answers to the idea that the way to approach these questions are through stories. One of the things I don't know whether we pick up now or whether we pick up later is, what if you haven't got that rich bank of stories? What if you yourself haven't got that literacy of it's a richness, really, isn't it, of being able to approach a question with a story? It becomes quite challenging to answer these questions, whereas mathematical answers look a lot easier and simpler because you can just learn those and, you know, think, well, somebody will have that answer somewhere away, even if it's, you know, far away in a box. But story answers, it's more challenging if you don't feel confident yourself. And I think that's one of the things that comes out, that lack of confidence, isn't it, really? Kieran?
Yeah, well, I'll respond to that point because I do lots of training with different audiences and businesses around storytelling, and and that feeling comes up. We don't know stories. We don't know how to tell stories, and the answer is you do. We don't know how to tell stories. It's in our DNA. It's in our bones. It's allowing us the permission to tell stories. And I can remember doing one big session with volunteers for a charity around storytelling. And an Irishman came up to me afterwards. He said, "Oh, absolutely fantastic. In Ireland, we have a saying, a man who can't tell a story might as well be dead." And I thought, although that's a bit harsh, but Ireland is a land of storytelling. And it's lovely when I visit kind of relatives or go back there and you forget, that the art of storytelling is just permission to sit around and tell stories. We can all do it, and it doesn't have to be good stories. It's just what we call storytelling from the heart, which is, how do you feel about something? You could tell a story about when you grew up, and a little narrative, and just kind of use these little storytelling as part of helping children to understand the world, without having to pull out a big heavy book on the questions and answers to life. This is what the Christians believe. This is what it's all very analytical. To storytelling, which also does something quite remarkable. When you tell a story, you're not there with, this is the information I have, I'm here to give it to you. This is like a face-to-face kind of communication. When you do storytelling, it's more of a shoulder to shoulder. So you look at a problem, over here to your right, and you're both looking at that issue, and sitting shoulder to shoulder, you tell a story around it. And what happens when you tell a story is your your mechanisms, to protect yourself kind of drop. And you allow yourself to come into that story. So it's when you tell a story, you can garner trust. You can help create a safe space. Once you create a safe space, people feel more free to open up and then talk about their story. And some of the work I do is in storytelling circles, where people sit in a circle and they tell their stories from their hearts. And when you do that, something really magical happens. Is what you open up a safe space for people to talk freely about how they really, really feel, not what they think people should think they feel. They start opening up. When you open up your heart through storytelling, you create a safe space of which the child may respond and say, actually, this is what I really believe, rather than going into the head and say, well, this is what Christians teach, this is what other people teach. What do you think? You choose X or Y, which is all very analytical. To move into a storytelling is it's a very different approach, it's a more subtle approach. But back to your point, is we can all do it, but
Yes.
it's allowing us the permission or the courage to do it. It's a challenging thing.
Your point about a safe space is so important, Kieran. It's a space which has no judgment attached to it, isn't it? It's a space where, and I think this is particularly one of the great resources that parents have, that the child knows the parents love and trust them. And the trust that the child has for the parent and the love the parent by the child creates that space where they can explore things. And if as parents we don't tell our children off while we're telling stories, or we don't make judgments while we're telling stories, or we don't we're not negative about perhaps some of the questions the child asks in that storytelling circle, then how much deeper children can go. And children absolutely love stories. I was thinking of the fairy stories which have been subverted. So Little Red Riding Hood, arrives at the big bad wolf's place and actually gets swallowed up and actually gets eaten by the wolf. And that's it. That's the end of it. Our children squeal. It shouldn't happen. That's the wrong way around. But it's that playing, that actual playing with stories and the playing with ideas is a very powerful it's a very powerful tool, a very powerful way of thinking through some very serious questions that are being asked.
And I think one of the key things that you both said was about that permission, and that permission about the safe space. And it's that idea that, of giving confidence to adults, not just to parents, to say, engage with this in a different way, engage with this through stories, that not to be afraid that you don't know the right answer. And I think we keep coming back to that idea that there should be a right answer to this. And much of the questions the children are exploring when they're exploring their spirituality, there are no right answers, but there are lots of different ways that you could explore it with them. And I think the other thing to pick up on this is the trust, that this is something that children will only do when they are in a safe space, when they trust people. It's not something, it becomes something quite private, something quite precious to them. It's not going to be done, with anybody, but with somebody they trust. And obviously the person most children trust most are their parents.
But I think in the research, Anne, you had parents saying that they didn't feel confident.
Yes.
When they're asked questions, as if they weren't qualified in some way to answer, deep questions. And I think what we've been discussing is actually parents have got the position, the unique position of being closest to the child and most able to offer that space, that safety in which to explore their deepest feelings.
I think that's really important. It's the, you know, a lot of parents feel that they have to deflect these questions to the teacher. Ask your teacher about that. Or even the parent themselves would go to the teacher and ask the question so that they can have an answer to give to the child, or ask the vicar, you know, where there's a good relationship with the clergy in a school, or, you know, well, save that one up and ask the vicar that question, where the child really just wants the parent to think it through with them and just explore with them, going back to Kieran's shoulder to shoulder, rather than, you know, give me the right answer and I could go away and that bit of my jigsaw is solved, I'll just move on to the next bit.
Yeah, and as a parent, it is really challenging. There's a few things there. One is a deep anxiety. I don't know. And I feel I've got my degree in theology. I'm quite well read on spiritual things. And the other day, while I was chopping onions, my daughter asked me, Dad, what's original sin? I was like, it's those moments when you're caught off guard. It's like, well, you know, how do I explain this one? And actually, she was just trying to ask your mother. That's what my wife does. I'll ask your father. These questions can come up at any given moment. So it might not just be about anxiety or caught off guard. And actually, how do you answer a deep question while chopping onions? It can be difficult. But also, the real challenging thing, I think, as a parent is in your child's eyes, you've always been there with the answers. You know, what's the capital of France? You know, I can tell the answer to that. What's 2 + 2? Fine. And children look to you as a font of all answers, and they get a bit suspicious if you don't know something. And, you know, my children delight when they find out I don't know something about their latest computer game. Oh, don't you know? You know, it's as if they have some sort of power over me. Or, you know, the latest pop song or whatever. So when it comes to questions, the big questions, and you turn around and say, "Oh, actually, I don't know," you know, so that kind of throws something, you know, quite significant up in the conversation. So part of me feels it's not so much a question of I don't know; it's more of right. That's a really deep question. There's different ways of seeing that. So back to the onion, you know, you can take it a layer at a time, without saying actually there are no answers. That's not very helpful either, because, well, I'll make up my own mind and they'll go off and make up their own mind at the young age of 6. You know, answers to one of the big life questions at the age of 6 isn't really very helpful. So it's open up to the conversation, say, actually, that's a big question, but let's explore together, knowing that the answer you might have is too deep for them as well. Like my answer around what is original sin was way too deep for what my daughter was looking for. I think she just had a question she wanted for her RE homework, so she was just looking at a very simple short answer. So it's about understanding. When we ask the big questions, there's layers of understanding, and knowing that, right, let's find out the layer where you're at now, but knowing that there's more to explore underneath. I'm not sure that messies or muddies the water a bit, but it's another way of looking at how do we answer those deep questions.
Yeah, I think you're right, and there is a bit in the animation where someone connected to the child says, "Well, you know, what do you think?" It's not up to me to tell you, what do you think, and kind of leaves it at that. And I really want to say something about the power of listening, because that question, what do you think, is a really good starter question. But what's really important is not to stop there and, you know, and just imply, well, it's up to you, you know, you can decide what to think, but actually to encourage the child. And I think that this is, again, part of the safe space, Kieran, that you talk about. That it's a space where, as a parent, we can listen to what our child is saying. And there may be, you know, the sort of questions we may be asking then are very open questions. You know, why are you thinking like that? Or, you know, or what, how do you mean? Or has something happened today which made you ask that question? You know, just slightly exploratory questions that allow the child to unpack something which might actually be quite distressing. You know, you find that sometimes with children who are bullied, and they don't want to own up that they've been bullied, or perhaps even that they have been bullying someone. But to be able in that safe space to talk because they are sure of being listened to allows them to move on, I think.
I think that's a key point. It's that listening, isn't it? It's just, you know, because you might jump in with an answer which is much too, you know, higher than they were expecting, or, you know, cut off a completely different tack. You just need to listen to find out what is the question that they are really answering. It's rather like that GP surgery thing where people go in and ask questions, and then just as they're going out the door, they ask the real question that, you know, they wanted to ask all along. Because with children, it's the same. That, you know, that first question might just be a starter, a feeler, and it's listening and unpacking, you know, what's really, you know, the questions here, and what really do we want to explore today. And they might have their own answers. They often might be just testing you to see, well, you know, does my answer work? If I was to say this, you know, how would other people react?
So the original sin question, Kieran.
I don't know. Answers on a postcard.
Well, but that question, it might be simply that you know, your daughter actually heard the phrase in some other context and just didn't know what it meant. Or it might be there was something that happened in school that actually prompted a worry, a concern.
Yeah.
And I was going to say to go back to where we started. We're talking about children's spiritual flourishing, and this is part of spiritual flourishing. This is their spiritual needs, a spiritual need to be listened to, for their concerns and their worries and their curiosities. Like, you know, why does the butterfly have such a beautiful wing? You know, for somebody to listen to them and explore with them, I think that's part of their spiritual needs, a child's spiritual needs. And we need that sort of focus on the child. What actually is the child saying? What is the child looking at? It's rather like, you know, looking at it through a child's eyes, which is really challenging and really difficult to do, but really important.
Yeah, and one of the phrases that came up in our conversation is, which I really liked and kind of resonates with me, was how do we keep children spiritually curious? Rather than right, if that's a question, how do I answer it? What's my 2 + 2 answer here? You know, the answer to original sin, you know, it's on a postcard, is you know, you're right. Here's an opportunity. I think what we looked at in the animation and in the research is, rather than seeing these questions as a threat or something we need to deal with to close down, you know, in case they come out with some other thinking, is to see it as an opportunity to step into the child's world, to stand shoulder to shoulder and actually go deeper and listen to them and discover what do we mean by that question. And that is such an enriching experience for a parent to do with your child, I think. That wonderful opportunity to sit down and say, what do you think? Because the other thing, for any parent, they'll know this. Children have the capacity to do some wonderful spiritual kind of wandering. They have the capacity for profound thoughts. They're not, you know, just these simple little automatons who have just received information, the outputs. They have this creative capacity to understand the world, and you as a parent, to be part of that journey, to witness that alongside them, it is so enriching. So rather than seeing, oh, here's a question, how do I answer it? So actually, here's an opportunity. Something great can happen here, where if I step into their world and start listening to them and go deep with those questions, in order for them to have the skills, the courage, the confidence to remain spiritually curious. And if at the end of the day, as a parent, my children grow up spiritually curious, I think I've done my job. is that they have it there. They have the foundations there. That they want to know more. That's the world isn't given to them. All the answers are there. There's nothing else. So they know there's much more there, and they can go deeper and deeper. If that's the foundation I can set in some way, I think job done in terms of spiritual development for a parent.
An element we've not mentioned is the element of reassurance, because I think when children are thinking of those really deep questions, they're not sure whether they are stupid or not.
Mm.
This sounds like a really stupid question.
Yeah.
Are you going to laugh at me because I asked this question? What is original sin? Are you going to turn around and say, what? What are you talking about? That's a stupid question. We have such power as parents, and teachers do as well, to inadvertently humiliate and our children and actually close up the conversation by suggesting that it's somehow the question is a stupid one. And if we can reassure children that firstly that no questions are stupid actually, and secondly that in fact those sort of questions are really good questions, the ones which might embarrass us. The most embarrassing questions for us might be the most interesting, and the most and the questions that reflect the deepest kind of thinking that our children are getting into, and that's to be encouraged.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think one of the things that comes out of it is it's not just for the child, it's the adult as well. If you can see something from a child's perspective, it's enriching as well for the child. I remember walking my granddaughter around to nursery, and there's this purple weed, I don't know the name of it, growing up on the path. And, tell her it's a weed. And she says, but why is it a weed? It's pretty. And you just think, yes, that gives a whole deep level of thought into, there's this pretty plant growing up in the pavement. And, and it's just seeing things from a different perspective that you've never thought of before. And children are brilliant at that. And I think we'd lose that if we just dismiss their questions as being stupid or, fancy saying that. But actually to sit and think, well, why are you seeing it that way? And maybe we, looking at it that way, it's a different way of looking at it. And maybe I can get something from that as well.
And I know we're speaking primarily about children, but also young people, grown up teenagers, is that they're grown up in a different world to us, and the opposite of that safe space, that place which we try to encourage, nurture in Faith in the Nexus, which is needed for spiritual growth. You have the opposite of that on social media, which is not a safe space. Is I think this, I think that, you're wrong, I'm right, and I can't stand commenting on a lot of posts, and it's you can't have a news article without someone say, oh, it's all rubbish. There's no in between. There's no nuance. I'm right, everyone else is wrong, and this has been kind of nourished and encouraged in our world today through this social media format. So there's a toxic environment out there for faith and spirituality. And so we have to acknowledge that in some way. And although children might not be on social media, the parents are, and they might pick up some of that. And the problem is, once you're involved in that toxic environment, you react to it. You go to your extreme. Well, obviously, everyone else is wrong, I'm right. And after that comes not very helpful kind of worldviews and points of opinion, and we can pass on to our children. So I think as parents, we also need safe space. I know we talk about children a lot, but the thing about spirituality, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens alongside parents. Parents also need the opportunity, so we all need the opportunity to stop, reflect, and ask a big question. So I also find when we talk about the opportunity to step into a child's world, to help them find the deeper answers to the questions they face, is also an opportunity for parents to step into and ask again, because some of those questions they might have not asked properly since they were 12 years old. They haven't explored it. You have the answer in the back of your head, but when you sit down again as an adult, so actually, what I think probably doesn't make sense anymore. So maybe I need to, go deeper with these questions and reflect more. So that the moment of opportunity is not just to help children in their spirituality. The idea it is a self-enclosed unit. So it's known that spirituality happens in conversation, in dialogue, and we grow alongside each other. So it's an opportunity for parents to grow in their faith and spirituality, not just their children.
The toxic life of social media that you talk about, Kieran, I think reflects a spiritual fragility. People who are upset or feel they've got to answer an article you were mentioning with something highly vituperative or unpleasant or nasty. They're looking for certainty. I'm right, you're wrong. That kind of binary, black and whiteness, which is absolutely counter to everything we're talking about. The whole purpose of the process of developing spirituality is to help children to grow that confidence in themselves, and grow, enable them to be confident in asking questions. A mantra for me is when Jesus says, when he says, "I am the truth, the way, and the life," and he's asked a question, and Jesus talks about the truth setting you free. And within the Christian context, our asking questions is a searching for truth, is a searching for a true picture of the world, one that I feel actually I fit in and I'm part of, and I can see my place in the world, and I can gain strength from the sort of things that Jesus says we should be doing. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself, and exploring those things come from a spiritual or help to develop a spiritual maturity, where we, however certain we may be in some things, we can continue asking questions and challenging in other areas because of that confidence we have in Christ.
I think it's that confidence, isn't it? It's that base of confidence from which you can go out, that you're in the basis of, the values of love, the trust, and the confidence, and you can go out and carry on searching. And if you haven't got that, the searching doesn't stop. As we're talking about this toxic social media environment, people keep searching, they're still searching, but they haven't got that foundation, which we talked about through the animation and through the research, that sort of foundation of trust, of safe space where you can go out and spiritually seek, and you have the confidence that you've got a safe space in which to do it, with that uncertainty, living with the uncertainty that there are not all the right answers out there.
So this has been about really about how children grow up spiritually, with a kind of emphasis on parents, but your Nexus, Anne, faith in the Nexus, actually involves not just parents; it involves much wider as well.
And I think that's really important, that we've spoken lots about parents today, but that sort of support from the school and from the church, if you accept that the parents, the home is the most influential place for a child. But actually what we found, a lot of what happens in schools is influencing the faith talk that goes on at home, that children are picking up ideas from school. And the other key thing we found, which I don't know whether we got time to explore today, was that sense of belonging to church. That actually having a sense of belonging to church in whichever way you interpret what church meant or what the parish meant, that was really important. And that gave you a sense of who you are, going back to where we started. Who am I? Where do I belong? And that sense of belonging that you get to church through a church primary school became critically important. So all the adults in that nexus, in that sort of hub of home, school and church, are really important influences on the child. And what we would, the idea that all of them would be exploring with the child rather than one area, maybe the church, maybe the school, having the right answers. So the parents feel, well, actually, I don't need to do this, don't need to explore this. They will get the right answers from the church school, or the right answers when they're in church. But actually, everybody has a role. Everybody needs to explore and not give what they think is the right answer, but just listen to what the child's saying and wants to explore. Thank you so much. That's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much to our guests, Kieran O'Brien and Nick Taunt. We've covered a lot today. We've looked at something that we believe, that spirituality is innate, that we're all spiritual beings. And we've explored quite a lot about parents being embarrassed to answer questions, parents having anxieties about answering questions, these deep questions that their children ask them. But we looked at, it's not about answering. That's it. It's not about answering the questions. It's about exploring. And we talked about how you can explore through storytelling, and looked a little bit about shoulder to shoulder, how we explore with the child, alongside the child, in a safe space. And parents are unique in being able to offer a safe space to the children. I think there's a lot here that we could explore further. And in our next podcast, we'll be exploring in greater the idea of spiritual flourishing of the child. And we'll look at some of the issues we've raised in this one, and to go a little bit deeper into what we mean by that shoulder to shoulder approach with the child through greater exploration of a child's spirituality.